In my first book, The Fifth Vital Sign, I argue that the menstrual cycle is an important vital sign that we should be paying attention to. I argue that your menstrual cycle is important regardless of whether or not you're actively trying to have babies now. And I also argue that charting your cycle using fertility awareness method tools is an essential step in truly understanding what's happening in your menstrual cycle. If you haven't grabbed a copy of The Fifth Vital Sign, you can read the first chapter for free over at thefifthvitalsignbook.com. And did you know that you can listen to The Fifth Vital Sign for free when you sign up for a 30-day trial with Audible? Head over to fertilityfriday.com/audible for details. That's fertilityfriday.com/audible. This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 549. In today's FAMM research series, I'm delving into a question that I don't think should be controversial, but always is. Does caffeine suppress appetite? So we're going to be diving into a study that examines this question, and I'm going to be sharing some of the things that I've observed over the years working with women, especially paying close attention to what's happening in their cycle. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right in. So in today's episode, I'm going through a review study that is looking at caffeine, coffee, and appetite control. And there were several things that struck me when I was preparing for the episode. I think one of the things that struck me the most was how little research there is into this question of the effect of caffeine on appetite. There are very few studies that actually look at this question. And as we'll talk about as we go through the study, the way that they are looking at the question, I would argue, is different to the way that people interact with caffeine in their day-to-day lives. So why does this question matter? So what's really interesting about the caffeine question is that no one is neutral, in my opinion, about caffeine. And the reason why I think that it is generally controversial when you bring up coffee, yet shouldn't be, is because of individuals and their attachment to coffee. So what I find is that, caffeine is a way of life. It's certainly one of the most social acceptable activities to do, to drink coffee every single day. And it is embedded into our culture. It's embedded into, if you're looking at movies, if you're looking at popular culture, if you just talk to your friends, if you watch any television program whatsoever, if you look at the variety of coffee mugs that say powered by coffee and don't talk to me until I've had my coffee. So it's deeply embedded into our culture. And especially, I would say for everybody, regardless of, whether they're male or female or whatever, but I would say in particular, it's one of those things for women that it's just part of the culture, kind of like wine. So it's like coffee in the morning and then wine at night. And if you start to question this caffeine part, because it's so embedded, it's so natural, it's just such a natural part of our culture, then it becomes controversial because people get real territorial about the coffee. So we're going to talk a little bit about that and how I think that it comes into the research that's out there and have an impact on even what is studied and what questions are asked. So the reason that I wanted to look specifically at the impact of caffeine on appetite is because one of the things that I've observed very consistently over the years is that there is a trend for, and I work primarily with women, so I can't speak to the men, but there is a trend for women to, whether it's intentionally, I think most of the time it's unintentionally, use coffee or caffeinated beverages as a substitute for meals. And so I have two main gripes with caffeinated beverages. And one is that there is this tendency to have coffee in the morning in lieu of breakfast or to delay breakfast. So maybe you're intermittent fasting, you're following your favorite male influencer who's talked about this. And so, there's a tendency to use caffeine to extend that fasting window in the morning so that you either skip breakfast altogether or delay it significantly. And that results in an overall lower consumption of food during the day. In Real Food for Fertility, we looked at intermittent fasting and we went into a lot of depth about it. And I've done some podcast episodes about some of those studies. And one of the studies that I looked at found that, even when you skip breakfast, you do have a tendency to eat more lunch. So when they looked at the study participants who skipped breakfast, they did tend to have a larger caloric consumption at lunch. But even with that larger intake of food at lunchtime, the overall intake for the day was still less. So when we're skipping breakfast, we're not making up for it calorically, even though we might be eating a little bit more at lunch and potentially a little bit more at dinner, maybe having a few more snacks. When breakfast is completely skipped, what the research showed us was that you're not making up for that. So that's one of my first initial gripes with caffeine and caffeinated beverages in women who have hormonal imbalances who are looking to improve their cycle. So I always like to qualify it. If your cycle's great and you have no issues, like you're charting and you can see that you're falling into normal parameters in every area, then we have nothing to talk about related to the caffeine because you're good to go. But what I find is that when I'm working with clients who do have hormonal imbalances, who are looking to optimize their cycle, when we look at this particular area, when we look at the caffeinated beverages, when we get a hold of that aspect of it and either lower or wean off of it, then we do see the cycle rebound in many areas, and we do see the hormone imbalances improve. So this is one of the reasons why I look at caffeine, why I talk about it, because of the real world changes that you can see in the menstrual cycle when you clean this up. So it's not just because I have this opinion or because I think so. Frankly, when I came into this work, I was pretty neutral about caffeine, and I thought it was excessive to it prohibited or to limit it. I was actually not, interested in that part of the conversation. I just didn't think it would make that big of a difference. But after years and years of working with actual human beings and looking at their menstrual cycle and having these conversations and seeing what happens when you actually remove the daily caffeinated beverage habit and how it has, positively impacts overall cycle health, this is the reason why it's still on the table. And this is why I'm willing to delve into it, even though there's often very, very strong responses. I find it so interesting that, so many women and practitioners will advocate for coffee. And we'll talk about some of the positive. There's a lot of research about caffeine, and most of it is positive, about the positive effects on attention and athletic performance. There's a ton. There's even some studies on its impact on weight loss, which of course I would argue is because of the impacts, or at least partly due to the fact that it does have an impact on appetite and food consumption. But either way, there's an overwhelmingly positive, research library regarding caffeine and its benefits. But interestingly, very limited research specifically on this question of how it affects appetite. And I feel like it has something to do with the bias because of, again, everyone loves their coffee, right? So that's a good place to start. Let's dive a little bit more into the study itself. So in this review study, the researchers did a search and scan to find research papers that were actually looking at this question of how caffeine affects appetite. And one of the things that I found really interesting about their study design and the studies that they chose is they had a really high bar. So they were specifically looking for studies that examined this question about caffeine specifically. And they were looking for studies that were really high quality. So studies that had a placebo. So the placebo, double-blind placebo-controlled trial scenario. And the studies then that they chose and selected for this review, many of them were done in a controlled environment where participants were either given the caffeine or placebo, and they were also provided meals. So they were, some of these studies were looking specifically at, if I give you caffeine and then I provide you with a meal 3 to 4 hours later, how much of that meal are you going to consume? And is caffeine impacting how much you're going to eat? So while I think this is a really, it's a high quality study design, and while I think that these studies are really looking at, they're giving people meals so that they can calculate how much food is, like how much energy. They're specifically looking at the macronutrient content of the food. So they're really specifically measuring it, probably weighing it, like all those things. So you can get this really controlled, very, highly scientific measure of how this caffeine impacts what you're going to do and how much you're going to eat. and look at the group that doesn't have the caffeine versus the group that does, provide the same meal and see how much they actually consume. So obviously highly scientific. But in the real world, that's not how it works. When you're looking at women's lives, if they're consuming coffee in the morning, it's often a habit that is developed and sustained over many, many years. And they're not being provided with a meal at a specific time. And so the tendency that I've seen in the real world is that we're not seeing this scenario. We're seeing the coffee contribute to the suppression of appetite, which then allows these women, again, in real world scenarios, to potentially delay their breakfast. Now, some of you are thinking, yeah, Lisa, but I don't do that. I have it sorted out. I actually drink my coffee with my breakfast or my caffeinated beverage. So I'm good. I don't skip breakfast. It's just part of what I do. And I would still argue that what I've observed in the real world is when I have clients who do that, yes, they're consuming their breakfast, but arguably they're eating less lunch because the appetite suppressant effect of the caffeinated beverages are still there. So let's find out what the researchers found with their study. Now, unsurprisingly, again, because the participants were given the caffeine and then 3 to 4 hours later, they were provided with a meal, the researchers found that there was an impact of having the caffeine on how much they would eat in terms of the specific kind of macronutrient intake, but it was minimal. So they didn't find this huge impact. They didn't find that when they gave the caffeine and then waited the 3 to 4 hours and then provided them with a meal, they didn't find that there was like a huge difference, but they did consistently find that there was a difference. So the participants were eating a bit less macronutrient wise, but it wasn't this huge, like significant drop in terms of the amount that they were consuming. And they separately measured energy. So again, they were, weighing the food, doing all the things so that they could determine the specific amount of energy that the participants were eating. So instead of just looking at the protein, fat, carb, grams, and stuff like that, they were looking at the energy, which they measured in kilojoules. And they did find that when the participants were given caffeinated beverages, there was a greater reduction in the amount of energy. When they looked at the energy, the energy content of the food, there was a reduction in that. So what we can gain from the study was even in this highly controlled environment where participants were actually given meals, there still was an effect. So they still found that there was a suppressive effect on appetite. But of course, I would argue that the study itself is not as real world. So I'd be really curious just to see a different kind of study design. But I think these food studies are very difficult because if you just let people live their lives, and just do whatever they're going to do, then you're not able to like weigh all the food and have it to be so specific. And then what are you going to do? Like hold people in a room for days and just have food out and let them decide if they're going to eat or not? Again, it's a little bit different or difficult, I would say, to really kind of look at these questions that we have in a scientific way. But either way, I thought it was really interesting that A, there was a difference and it was consistent, and B, that even the researchers acknowledged that this was an area that was widely understudied. And there wasn't necessarily hundreds or thousands of research papers that they were drawing from. Ultimately, for their review study, they chose 12 studies that met their criteria. Real Food for Fertility is your ultimate guide to optimizing your nutritional stores before pregnancy. In Real Food for Fertility, my co-author Lily Nichols and I argue that a healthy menstrual cycle sets the stage for optimal fertility and a healthy pregnancy. You can read the first chapter for free over at realfoodforfertility.com. And did you know that you can listen to Real Food for Fertility for free when you sign up for a 30-day trial with Audible? Head over to fertilityfriday.com/realfood, one word, for details. That's fertilityfriday.com/realfood. Now let's go ahead and jump back into today's episode. So I suppose one question that you could look at is, why does this matter? If consuming caffeinated beverages reduces your appetite, how would that have an impact? So to bring it back to how I found that it affects clients of mine is that, again, when you're looking at the menstrual cycle under a microscope and you're seeing evidence of hormonal imbalances, you're seeing evidence of low progesterone, whether that's the increased PMS symptoms, shortened luteal phase, whether you're seeing spotting before your period or other signs of hormonal imbalance. And when you're working with a client who's having a difficult time sleeping. So when you have a client who either has a hard time falling asleep or, wakes up a lot at night or, sometimes wakes up and stays up for long periods of time, whenever there's an issue with sleep, and then we also have this issue with hormone imbalance, all these things are connected. And just what I found so consistently, is that when caffeine is addressed, so whether, and I would say, as much as I'd love to say just reducing it is enough, I would say that reducing it obviously is going to help, but there's a difference between reducing it and cutting it out. So what I've observed is, and maybe some of you have observed this as well, so for those of you who are caffeine drinkers, whether that's coffee, caffeinated, tea, whether that's energy drinks, or whether it's like full on pop, like soda, whatever your option is for the caffeine consumption, have you ever stopped drinking the caffeine altogether for like a couple of days? So in my personal experience, if I drink coffee or caffeinated beverages for days on end, which is very rare these days, then if I stop, even if I were to drink coffee for 3 days in a row, and then I stop, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and then I stop on Thursday. On Thursday, I have got a withdrawal headache. So there's research to show that these withdrawal symptoms, they're pretty common. And some of the most common withdrawal symptoms include things like, headaches and maybe a little bit of irritability, reduced alertness. And so there's that, that whole concept of withdrawal is pretty significant. And I would say, from what I've seen anecdotally from working with a variety of women, when they stop coffee, like I've had a lot of clients who will, maybe they'll experiment with reducing, but a lot of my clients just go all in and they'll just be like, okay, I'm just going to stop and see what happens. And for like a week, it's like they have the worst week. They feel awful. They feel tired. They have a headache. They just don't feel good. They have a hard time getting up. But once that initial withdrawal period is over, then what I find is that they'll start to feel better. So their energy will actually improve after that initial kind of terrible withdrawal scenario. And then their overall sleep will improve. And then their appetite increases. And they find themselves eating more at breakfast or eating more at lunch. And it's so consistent. It happens so consistently. It just, it's something that I found. And then we see the impact on the menstrual cycle, because the menstrual cycle is really sensitive to how much food we eat. And one of the things that Lily and I said in Real Food for Fertility, at least once, maybe a couple times, we wanted to reinforce that, coffee is not breakfast. And if you're looking to optimize and balance your menstrual cycles and support, regular normal hormone production, the best thing for a reproductive age, human female, is to consume 3 meals a day with sufficient protein, fat, and carbohydrates in balance, and, basically getting enough food throughout the day. And we shared the research indicating that if you're skipping meals, it's really hard to get the optimal amount of food, because you just can't, stuff yourself enough to make up for that meal. I mean, you might think that you do, but if we look at the kind of real world data, if we look at the research data, it would indicate that you're likely not getting as much as you need. And then it has other disruptive effects on hormones. So there's a net benefit, a net gain to reducing the caffeine, even though it's controversial. And even though I know that some of you are listening, rolling your eyes, like, I'm not going to stop drinking my coffee. It doesn't affect me. It doesn't affect my sleep. I'm good to go. And that's all great. One thing I have to say is that caffeine habits are not generally like a month long. They're generally years. So when I have clients who are like, it doesn't affect me, it's great. These are clients who've been drinking coffee every day, twice a day, maybe 3 times a day, maybe for like 5 to 10, maybe longer years, And so I would just lovingly say, how do you know? Because if you've literally drank coffee every day or some sort of caffeinated beverage for like 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, then how would you even know what it would be like without it? How would you even know what your quality of sleep would be like if you didn't have it? And so there's a couple things, just food for thought, that I would like to share. If you were to give up like grapes, so like you eat grapes every day, maybe that's not the best example, but like choose your favorite fruit. Like, we eat a lot of apples in my house. So if you were to eat apples every day for years, and then like you stop eating apples for a week, what happens? Nothing. The nothing burger happens. Your mood doesn't change, your energy levels don't change, nothing changes. But if you eliminate coffee, if you're a coffee drinker and you drink, 1, 2, 3 cups of coffee every day and you just stop, your life is awful for a week because you feel horrible. So obviously it's doing something to your body. And so even though there's all this research about all the positive impacts of coffee and how it can affect alertness and things like that, I would argue that, if you're not getting good sleep or if you are waking up feeling groggy, and yes, the coffee helps with your alertness, is that really optimal for your hormones to have this crutch? So definitely something to think about. And I hope that I've given you some food for thought. Now, I will just reiterate one thing that I said toward the beginning of this episode, which is I am not here to make you give up your coffee. You do whatever you want to do. Like, everyone is different. I really actually like the taste and smell of coffee. So let me put that out there. I will drink a decaf latte at Starbucks because I really like the smell of it and the taste of it as well. So I'm not even going to pretend like I don't like a good cup of coffee. But again, it's not about me. It's about you. So I'm not here to take away anyone's coffee. I'm just here to provide food for thought and an interesting conversation piece. So to reiterate what I said earlier, if you are, working with myself or some of our FAMM practitioners and your cycles are amazing and you have like no issues and your hormones are balanced and you feel great in all areas, like you're sleeping good, like no PMS, nothing, no weird cycle issues, like nothing, you're totally amazing, then we don't need to talk about the caffeine because you're good, right? You're totally fine. And the flip side of that is that if you are struggling with some hormonal imbalances or negative symptoms that are actually having a negative impact on your life, it's only then when, I bring this up as conversation, as, have we looked at this area? Let's talk about it. Let's see what's going on. Let's do an experiment if you're open to it. It really depends on what is happening in your life. And if you are struggling with something, and if the thing that you're struggling with is a big enough deal for you to want to see an improvement and to do, and be curious enough to do an experiment to see if it's something that's going to have a positive impact on your life. Because at the end of the day, everyone is so different. And that's one of the things I love about cycle charting, is that you can't be under the impression that one protocol, one way of doing things is going to work the same way for everybody when you are using the menstrual cycle as a vital sign and a tool and a way to measure how people are doing in their progress. Because you will see it. You will see that you have one client and they do a certain thing a certain way, and it has this amazing impact on their cycle. And you'll see another client do the same thing in the same way, but it will not have the same impact. And maybe a different strategy will work really, really well for that person. So there's certainly no one size fits all approach. And there is, of course, research suggesting that caffeine affects people differently. There's studies that show that if a person is a little bit more overweight compared to another person, that the way that they process caffeine, the way that their hunger cues and appetite are impacted are different, even just with the difference in weight. So we're all different. That's just one example, just to kind of put it out there, because I was looking at some, caffeine related research to prepare for this episode. But the point is that there's no one right way. This is not to say that everyone needs to do this or everyone needs to do that. But, if you're looking for a little additional edge, you've tried a lot of different things, you're not seeing the results that you're wanting to in your cycle, then this could be one of the reasons why. And if you're curious enough to do, your own little mini caffeine challenge and track your cycles and track your progress, then you would have the opportunity to see if it's something that could have a positive impact for you to look at the way that you're engaging with your caffeinated beverages. So I hope that you enjoyed today's episode. I hope that it gave some food for thought. And I plan to share a few additional caffeine related episodes in the coming weeks, just to kind of put it out there and to see what the response is, to see if this is still a controversial topic, and to see if, I love to see the responses of it. Because like I said, I do find that with caffeine in particular, there's often a visceral emotional response from certain clients when you bring it up, because again, it's so embedded in our culture. It's such a common thing. Most people are drinking coffee every day, and no one is talking about any potential negative effects. And there's predominantly so much positive research out there about, those potential benefits of it. So I do find that it is one of those things that can be highly touchy for people to even talk about it. So here I am diving into the controversy because I think it's fun. And I think it's really useful to kind of shift some of your opinions on it. One last thing I'll say is that, for the practitioners that are listening, so if you're a women's health practitioner, and if you personally love your caffeinated beverages, you drink your caffeinated teas, and of course you're saying, yeah, Lisa, but caffeinated tea has way less caffeine than regular coffee, and I'm fine, right? All the things that all the things, right? So one thing I would say is that it's really important to be aware of your own biases as a practitioner. So if you are not a coffee drinker at all, and you're on a militant hunt to get all of your clients off caffeine, that's not going to work because everyone is different and it's not necessarily a problem for everybody. On the flip side, if you are a caffeine drinker, a regular caffeine drinker, and you personally don't feel like there's any negative effects whatsoever for you, you might allow that to cloud how you work with clients, because there may be clients who are sensitive to it, who it is having a negative impact on, and you may be biased in favor of caffeine and think that it's not a big deal and not look at that area for someone for whom it could be the key that changes their whole cycle. So this is why it's so important to read research and to kind of understand and own and recognize our own personal biases so that when we're working with clients, we're not pushing our biases on them, whether it be the one side or the other. So if you enjoyed today's episode and you can think of someone who may benefit from hearing it, the share link is fertilityfriday.com/549. I hope that you have a wonderful weekend, whenever you're tuning into the show. And of course, as always, until next time, be well and happy charting. And that's a wrap. If you're loving the Fertility Friday podcast, then I know you'll love FAMM, our Fertility Awareness Mastery Mentorship Certification Program. It's a 9-month program designed to teach you how to use the menstrual cycle as a diagnostic tool in your women's health practice. The menstrual cycle is the missing piece you've been looking for to better support your clients to balance hormones, normalize their cycles, and optimize their fertility. When you join FAMM, I pull back the curtain and share advanced chart interpretation strategies and specialized client protocols that will completely transform your practice. Enrollment for FAMM is opening up again in a few months. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/FAMMlive to join the waiting list and be the first to know when early bird registration opens. That's fertilityfriday.com/FAMMlive.